Thank you, Chair. And I suppose at the outset I want to welcome you, Sir Major, and to say that during your time and all of your time I actually lived in London, so at the time of your Prime Ministership. Now, I suppose I want to look at the Good Friday Agreement in terms of it being a living document, as we are, and we're the implementation committee of the Good Friday Agreement. And obviously the British and Irish governments are co-guarantors of that agreement. And in the Good Friday Agreement, and indeed the 2003 Joint Declaration in St Andrews, in NDNNA, all of those committed to a Bill of Rights. So I suppose the gaping hole of the Good Friday Agreement, or the implementation, is the unfulfillment of where the British government said they would complete incorporation into Northern Ireland law of the European Convention on Human Rights, with direct access to the courts and remedies for breach of convention, including the power for the courts to overrule the Assembly legislation on the grounds of inconsistency. But I suppose my question to you is, as a committee here and using your experience, what more can be done in order to ensure that what was promised in the Good Friday Agreement is delivered, and that the two guarantors, and indeed anybody else involved, make sure that that happens? So that's my first question.
The straightforward questions with that are always the most difficult to answer, because the answer is, to a certain extent, non-specific. The only thing really that can be done is to continually to argue, to lobby, to press for agreements that were promised to be honoured. And you often have to go back again and again and again to get something determined that ought to be determined without frustration. And clearly, I think you're probably in that area there. There's no silver bullet that can compel people to do it. It can only be done by persuasion, but the persuasion should be consistent. It is why one of the many reasons I favour the closest possible relationship between Dublin and London, why it is a good idea that there are members of all the political parties in Westminster, as well as in Dublin or in Belfast, and they're all in a position to press. I've really nothing better to offer than that. If you feel strongly about it, and it was promised, then it is absolutely politically legitimate to press again and again and again, either for the promise to be honoured, or alternatively for an explanation that you accept as to why circumstances have changed. I'm not sure that they have changed, so I have sympathy with your view. I think you should just continue to press it.
Yeah, thank you, Sir John. I suppose in looking at it, we're a quarter of a century the other side of the agreement, and I suppose we question here in terms of what co-guarantor means and the responsibilities that are there on both governments to ensure that those agreements are fully implemented. So I think it's a concern, but I also think in terms of a lot of the challenges that people in the North face, even right now, would not be as challenging were those agreements to be implemented in full. I mean, we've already talked about Stormont House, but just even in terms of the Bill of Rights, if there was universal rights across, regardless, for all citizens in the North, then that would alleviate much of the pressures that are there right now. So that's why I just think it's really important. But the other question I just want to ask you, and it's maybe of curiosity from my own point of view, when I lived in England and lived in London, the north of Ireland was never really a priority for people living in England. Would you say it's more or less of a priority now than it was 25 years ago?
Well, I preface this answer with saying I'm not in Parliament. And I preface it that because if you're in Parliament, you get letters from constituents, you meet constituents, you're in constant communication with people, and you pick up a view that is a good deal wider than simply your own. I no longer I'm a private citizen now. I no longer get that. I declined to go to the House of Lords, so I'm not in either House of Parliament. But I think because of the publicity that has been given to the dispute with the European Union over the protocol, I think it probably is higher in people's minds than it was in the early 90s. That may seem very strange when you think of the violence in the early 90s, but I suppose if something goes on for a long time, it becomes background. And the violence had gone on for a very long time. It was background. In the early days of the Troubles, if something happened, it was headline news. As the years moved on, it slipped down the news agenda a bit. So it may be that the profile is a little higher now. And certainly the fact that we don't have a functioning executive in Stormont, which is important to the south as well as the north, and you have this dispute that is carrying on over the protocol, I think probably the profile is a little higher. What I understand is the case is that the relatively new Secretary of State in the North is keen to develop closer relationships. There are parts, as you say, of the Good Friday Agreement that aren't implemented and aren't working at the moment, like the cross-border agreements. It may be a good time for a little flexibility on both sides that can lead to some deals. But I go back to the point I made a few moments ago. In order to get deals, you have to talk and you have to listen. And that is the only way in which we're going to get them.
Okay, thank you, Chair.